And welcome back, everybody, to the Law News Network. I'm your host, Rachel Stockman, also editor-in-chief of LawNewz.com, the website where we post many of the articles and with information about the cases that you've been following here on the network. For the last few minutes, you've been listening to some of the replay testimony from the John Valerio case, which is a case out of Nevada that we've been covering. Again, folks that are just joining us, usually on the network, we show trials where it's really in the first phase, right, where we're hearing the evidence for the first time. This is actually a 31-year-old case, and this is just the retrial of the death penalty phase because the Ninth Circuit overturned the jury instructions that were given to the jurors at the time when they deliberated on the death penalty. I wanted to bring in at this time another guest to join me, Jessica Jackson Sloan. She's an attorney out of California. She has represented some death row inmates on their appeals. And also she's the mayor of Mill Valley, California, and also works for a nonprofit organization there in California. It's actually a nationwide nonprofit organization. So Jessica, thanks so much for joining us. You're a very, very busy woman. And we're so glad that you are taking a few minutes to join us this morning. Tell us what you think about this case that we're hearing in Nevada and kind of why this is a little bit, well, it's very unusual.
Well, it is unusual, but, you know, as somebody who's represented death row inmates, I understand that many years down the line in habeas appeals, cases can be overturned, either the guilt phase or the penalty phase. What we have here is the fact that the death penalty has been overturned in this case as the depravity of the mind standard was found to be too vague by the Ninth Circuit. So now they're going to have a new penalty phase in which they look at the evidence afresh. The guilt phase is still going to stand, but they'll have a new penalty phase looking at some of that evidence that came in around sentencing, where the jury was deciding whether they were going to sentence Mr. Valerio to life in prison or to death.
And we were talking a little bit with our last guest, Caroline, about this. A lot of the folks that watch the Law News Network are not attorneys. They're just trial watchers that really are interested in our legal system and how our justice system works. So when we talk about depravity of the mind and why that being the reason that the Ninth Circuit overturned the death penalty phase in this situation, what exactly does that mean? Why was that such a concern for the judges?
Listen, when it comes to death penalty, our goal should be, if we're going to have it, to make it as narrowly applied as possible. So back in the 70s, there was a famous case that came up to the United States Supreme Court in which they looked at the death penalty and found that it was being arbitrarily applied because there really wasn't guidance as to which cases were going to get the death penalty and which cases would get life. So a lot of other factors, including implicit bias, of course, were coming into play that were making the application of the death penalty pretty arbitrary. So the court ruled that in order to have the death penalty, we would have to have what's called narrowing circumstances or special circumstances. It would have to be narrowly applied so that it could only fit what they hoped would be the worst of the worst cases. Some of those factors, they vary from state to state, depending on which state you're in and whether or not they even have death penalty. They'll also have different special circumstances. In Florida, I believe there's upwards of 20 different special circumstances, same here in California. And what I don't think the court intended was that many of those special circumstances, which include things like heinous, atrocious, and cruel, or cold, calculated, and premeditated. Many of those special circumstances have really been expanded through case law as to which cases they would apply to. So what we see is a legislative intent in creating those special circumstances to really narrow the class of individuals that the death penalty applies to. But as time has passed and case law has come down from various state Supreme Courts or even circuit courts or the Supreme Court, those words have been construed more and more broadly. So the class of folks that the death penalty can be applied to has really been expanded through these special circumstances. We actually saw a case here in California in which there was a challenge to those special circumstances, and the fact that instead of narrowing, it was actually broadening the number of people who the death penalty was being applied to. And that was actually a serious point of litigation here in California, and I imagine will continue to be throughout the country.
When we talk about some of these issues, I mean, a lot of times it gets a little bit bogged down in some of the legal nuances.
Yes.
And obviously, you know, sometimes they're very tough to understand, especially for someone that's perhaps not trained in the legal system, doesn't have a law degree. But Jessica, I think you would agree the reason why these things are so important and people should care is because this is really comes down to a life or death situation for Mr. Valerio. As we watch this death penalty retrial that we're going to be airing here on the network, and we have been airing yesterday, these issues are of tantamount importance. And Jessica, I asked another guest who is actually a attorney that practiced similar law in Las Vegas about this, and I'm curious to get your reaction. In the Valerio case, because it's a 31-year-old case, they've actually had to read in some of the testimony from back when it was first tried. They had to read in the medical examiner's testimony. Does that, in your mind, pose some constitutional questions because the defense in that scenario is not able to cross-examine the witness if testimony is just being read in?
Right. So the Supreme Court has held that we have a constitutional right to cross-examine our witnesses. As defense, we have a constitutional right. So when you get into these cases like Mr. Valerio's, where the verdict came down 31 years ago, what you end up seeing is a lot of those witnesses who were there at trial are no longer around. They're deceased, they're suffering illness, they're difficult to locate at times, and particularly in the penalty case or stage of the case where the jury is trying to decide, are they going to sentence him to live or are they going to sentence him to die? So now more than ever, having those penalty witnesses there and being able to cross-examine them and ask them the correct questions for the jury to really not only hear the substance of the information that they're giving them, but also weigh their credibility. We have a right to have those witnesses there, not just so that the jury can understand what it is that they're saying and have follow-up questions from the defense to prove their case, but also so that the jury can weigh whether or not that witness is actually credible and count that in their determination of life or death. So this is very difficult, and it's actually going to present a huge burden for the defendant, the fact that they're simply reading in testimony, the jury's missing that credibility piece, and the defense is going to be unable to cross-examine them as they would have at an original trial.
And if you're just joining us here on the Law News Network, I'm speaking with Jessica Jackson Sloan, who actually has had many of these death row inmate appeals, and she also runs a nonprofit and is also mayor of Mill Valley, California, a very busy woman. Here at the Law News Network, we have been following the John Valerio case out of Las Vegas, Nevada. If you didn't get to catch much of the testimony yesterday, because this is a case where we're in a different time zone than we are here in New York, so we've been going a little bit late into the evening. We saw 2 cops and 1 medical examiner testify. And at one point, the defense actually attacked one of the detectives by claiming he was testifying to things that other officers saw, not what he saw. Again, what makes this case so interesting, and what I was talking to Jessica about, is the fact, you know, this is a 31-year-old case, and there's so much difficulty in kind of recounting some of the details. But Jessica, does it really matter? Because at the end of the day, if you read the Ninth Circuit opinion, I mean, the guilt of Mr. Valerio is really not up for question in this case at all.
Well, the guilt might not be up for question, and the Ninth Circuit has held that his guilt phase is going to remain regardless. So he has been found guilty of murder, But here in the United States, not everybody who's found guilty of murder actually gets the death penalty. In fact, it's a very small percentage, less than 10% of the murder cases that are found guilty of murder actually end up getting the death penalty. The legislative intent in most states behind having a death penalty is to deter people from committing murder, although some would argue, and I would argue, that it's not a deterrent because so few cases actually get the death penalty, but also to really punish the worst of the worst cases. What I can tell you honestly, having worked in criminal defense for nearly a decade now, is it's not the worst of the worst cases that get the death penalty. It's normally the cases that have the worst representation that end up getting the death penalty. So yes, this is extremely important. He has a constitutional right to a fair trial, to due process, to be able to cross-examine witnesses, to be able to present a complete defense, which is going to be very difficult to do now 31 years later, and to essentially save his life, so that he is not put to death by the Nevada government.
And Jessica, thanks so much for joining us. If you don't mind sticking around for a few more minutes, in the meantime, while Jessica's on standby, I want us to listen to a little bit more of the testimony from retired Detective James Vaccaro, who took the stand yesterday and talked about, he was one of the detectives that was on the scene when this all unfolded 31 years ago. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, and we'll bring Jessica in just a few minutes.
Do the cops follow this truck?
They do. They created surveillance following the vehicle for a long period of time. One of the detectives associated with the case wanted to pull alongside of the vehicle so that he could visually look clearly at the individual to determine if it was John Valerio. At that time, most of us were in possession of a photograph of Mr. Valerio. And so we were trying to ascertain before we stopped the vehicle if that was in fact him.
Was there some confusion, but did he look differently than Detective Hatchett described him?
Yes. Throughout that early part of the investigation, right after the shooting, he was described as possibly a Hispanic male with a full beard. And the individual in the car with Billy Childers, or in the truck rather, did not have a beard but had a mustache. But one of the detectives did announce over the radio to everyone that it was approaching the area of the Naples residence. They were coming back to that area, and that the individual in the vehicle was in fact John Valerio.
Does the vehicle ever wind up going back to Naples, or does it go somewhere close?
It gets very close. It ends up right south of Naples and Paradise at what was then a Macayo's restaurant. It's gone now, but there's a parking lot. There's a business right at that intersection, and then just to the south is an open desert lot now, but there was a Macayo's restaurant. And it was at that location that it was collectively decided by the members of the surveillance team to take the vehicle down or do a felony car stop on the occupants of the vehicle in the parking lot of Macayo's.
And eventually the occupants removed.
Right. The SWAT officers at gunpoint removed those occupants to the ground outside of the pickup truck.
And was Mr. Childers as well as Mr. Valerio identified as the two occupants of that
Yes, they were.
Now let me talk, first of all, you wind up taking custody of Mr. Valerio at that point, is that correct?
Yes.
Let me talk about Mr. Childers. Does he wind up providing an interview to detectives investigating the case?
Yes.
And what does he explain about how it is Mr. Valerio wound up in his truck this day?
In brief, Mr. Childers' version is that his friend John Valerio came to his residence with a story that he had been shot at in his vehicle. He said that he needed to take a shower and get some fresh clothing, and that he asked for Mr. Childers to drive him back towards his residence so that he could retrieve an item.
And what items did he want to retrieve?
Mr. Childers tells us that Mr. Valerio wanted to go by way of the wash behind Naples Boulevard, come through the wash, in other words, not go directly to the residence, but walk through the wash and come up behind the building so that he could get into his apartment to retrieve a handgun from a washing machine where he had hidden it.
Now you have Mr. Valerio in your custody at this point. What do you do with Mr. Valerio?
At that point, Mr. Valerio is taken into custody. The lead detectives in the case are, as I said, Bob Leonard and Detective Dillard. And they wanted him transported back to our homicide office, where we have small interview rooms that we take a suspect into, and he was detained there with me. I sat with him, awaiting those detectives to come to the detective bureau to do that interview.
Eventually, does there come a point in time when Dave Hatch arrives in the area where Mr. Valerio is being held?
Yes.
And describe for Liz and the jury what happens at that point.
Well, at some point after his responsibilities at the shooting scene, Detective Hatch leaves the Naples Street, returns to the detective bureau. He is aware that I am sitting with Mr. Valerio, and Detective Hatch comes to the interview room where I am, and these have sliding doors, which I had the door ajar for fresh air to come in, and Detective Hatch reached his head in the door at that point, and I recognized him, and he looked at Mr. Valerio, and he used his hand and made a picture, or not a picture, but a motion with his hand like he had a gun, and pointed it at John Valerio. That was what Detective Hatch did.
And what was the response from Mr. Valerio to that?
Mr. Valerio, who had been really calm with me up until that point, got upset and said, I should have hit you, I tried to, and referring to the automobile and what he was doing with the vehicle on Naples.
And did that cause an argument then to ensue between Detective Hatch and Mr. Valerio?
It went back and forth for a couple of words, but Detective Hatch retreated from the doorway, and then Mr. Valerio calmed down.
Eventually, were you asked to transport Mr. Valerio to the Clark County Detention Center?
Yes.
And when you took Mr. Valerio...
And welcome back, everybody, to the Law News Network. I'm your host. I've been your host this morning, Rachel Stockman, also editor-in-chief of LawNewz.com. You were listening to some testimony from the John Valerio case, a case out of Las Vegas, Nevada, that we've been following here on the Law News Network, bringing it to you live. Of course, very interesting case because this is a retrial of the death penalty phase. And so we have been hearing some testimony of an incident that happened 31 years ago where Mr. Valerio is accused or convicted of stabbing a prostitute 45 times. The question in this is really not did he do it, he was convicted, but it's whether there's enough to put him to death, and that's what the jurors in this case are deciding. You just heard from one of the detectives who was on the scene. I'm joined now by Jessica Jackson Sloan. She's been with us a little bit this morning. She's out of California, is also an attorney who has taken many of these death row cases. She was telling me about one that happened back in 2005. That was the last one that happened in California. But Jessica, you did a little bit of research into death row cases and executions in Nevada, and what did you discover?
So across the country, we've seen death penalty being overturned either by the courts or by the will of the voters, or in some ways just by lack of practice. So since 1977, 160 people have been sentenced to death in Nevada. But only 12 of those people have actually been executed, and 11 of them voluntarily gave up their appeals to be executed. So they waived their appeals, said, listen, I've been convicted of death. I'm just going to take the death penalty. So what's the most interesting of all that is the fact that 88 convictions of those 160, so more than half of the convictions since Nevada reinstituted the death penalty, were reversed on appeal, and 50 of those defendants were removed from death row permanently. So, you know, this case and many others in Nevada and across the country really raises the question not just of the constitutionality of the death penalty, but actually the practicality of having the death penalty. It's extremely expensive. It costs roughly $1.2 million in Nevada per death sentences.
Wow,
because you have
$1.2 million. That's incredible.
And the average murder trial there, according to the research I looked at, was about $530,000. So it's really double the price for a death sentence when the death penalty is not being applied very often. Half the cases are being reversed, and almost a third of the defendants sentenced to death have actually been removed from death row since receiving that sentence.
Again, very interesting case that we're following out of Las Vegas, and testimony in that case, because it is in a different time zone here, is supposed to begin about 1 o'clock Eastern time, 10 o'clock Las Vegas time. And I want to thank so much Jessica Jackson Sloan for joining us out of California. We hope you come back again on the program. We very much appreciated your insights. A little bit